Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Deep True Crime. I'm Manny Rodriguez. In today's episode, I want to share with you the Timothy Bliefnick story. Just convicted of killing his wife, Becky Bliefnick. Unbelievable. In a sense that he kind of admitted he regretted getting married on national television. You see, he was a contestant on Family Feud. He literally said he regretted it. He regretted saying, "I do." You see, the host, Steve Harvey, he's the host of Family Feud. And so the Bliefnick family was on Family Feud. This fool, when he was asked, "What's your biggest mistake that you made at your wedding?" That's what Steve Harvey asked Timothy Bliefnick. You know what this guy says? Said, "I do." He said he regrets saying he does. I do. You know, when you get married, you say, "I do." He literally said that on national television. So, of course, this Family Feud video would come back to the forefront of all of this because he nationally said he regretted marrying her. He kind of jokingly said that. But then when she later is killed in a home invasion, a staged home invasion, well, you have to go back to this video, right? And so now Timothy Bliefnick, he has been found guilty on all charges, which include first-degree murder, home invasion, in connection with the death of his estranged wife, Becky Bliefnick. The Adams County jury, they reached this verdict yesterday, May 31st. Today, June 1st. Now, Bliefnick, he's still in jail because he still has to go back for his sentencing hearing that is scheduled for August 11th at 1:30 p.m. So he is still going to be in jail without any bail. Consequently, Bliefnick now confronts the prospect of a life sentence behind bars. I'm going to tell you straight up, I believe he's going to get literally life behind bars. This is a very heinous event. And I want to take time to say rest in peace to Becky Bliefnick. I pray that the family finds closure now that there is finally justice being done against Tim Bliefnick. Rest in peace, Becky Bliefnick. I'm sorry for your loss to the family of Becky Bliefnick and all her little kids. During the closing arguments on Wednesday, both the prosecution and defense, they engaged in a heated exchange in the murder trial of Tim Bliefnick. Again, a former Family Feud contestant and estranged husband to Becky Bliefnick. This case revolves around the death of Becky, a nurse and a mother of three, which occurred on February 23rd in Quincy, Illinois. Now, the Adams County State Attorney's Office meticulously presented a substantial amount of circumstantial evidence to establish that the defendant is definitely responsible for Becky's murder. However, and of course, the defense argued that the prosecution's presentation was akin to a game show and that they failed to provide any concrete evidence linking Tim to the crime. Now, of course, we hear this all the time, right? This is generally something that they always say. Literally, this is always a big deal, right? Assistant State's Attorney Josh Jones, he addressed the jury by focusing on the core question of the case. Did the defendant do it? Now, Josh Jones, he proceeded to analyze the state's circumstantial evidence, highlighting a significant piece involving a blue bike with no reflectors that was captured in a grainy but revealing video. The prosecution contended that Tim had purchased this bike through a Facebook account under the name John Smith, which was later discovered on his phone along with suspicious internet searches that he did. According to Jones, Tim deliberately rode the bike to Becky's residence, fully aware that she would be alone. He allegedly used a crowbar, as he had learned from online sources, to pry open his son's empty bedroom. Now, as he shared, the defendant looked down at her, looked her in the eye, and shot her 14 times. He shot her with a gun with a homemade silencer that he read about on the internet. The prosecutor emphasized that the 8 shell casings that was discovered near Becky's body were a match to the 27 shell casings subsequently recovered from Bliefnick's residence. And he says that they were fired by the exact same gun. That's what he said of all the shell casings that were found. And he even shared becoming more vengeful and more predictable. And prosecutors, they presented evidence indicating that Becky had expressed fear of Bliefnick's potential violent behavior during their brutal and contentious divorce. This concern was evident in a call that the defendant made to the police on February 10th, just 13 days prior to Becky's murder, as stated by the prosecution. Now, the defendant was quoted saying, "I've got to give a gun back to that crazy bitch. I don't feel safe around her." That's what he shared. Now, the prosecutor, Jones, he noted that the person claiming not to feel safe was active in CrossFit and was inducted as recently as 2009 into the Quincy University's Football Hall of Fame. And so this guy was not a weak link, as, you know, he's like acting like he's in trouble, like something bad is going to happen to him. And when you really think about it, he was a strong guy. I mean, you're talking about a former football player. And when you stop and think about that, you wonder, like, okay, is he really think anyone's going to buy into him being afraid of her? And so that's why he was like, and this is just demonstration purposes only, but that's why he was upset that he was having to give a gun back. That's what he was stating. That was not so much the case. Okay? He had his own ill intentions. He was an accomplished linebacker at Quincy University. And that's why they inducted him in 2009 into the Football Hall of Fame. And so that's why it's like, it was hard for anyone to actually buy into what he was saying. Now, witness testimony from Becky's friend Melissa Young attributed these statements to the defendant as well. "You'll be dead before you get my money. I'm tired of playing your stupid little game." That's what he was saying in reference to Becky. And so, additionally, there was plenty of evidence, literally plenty of evidence, that Becky told others that she was the one who was afraid. And she even said, if things really don't go his way, I feel he can be very unstable and unpredictable. That was her fear. She said in one representative fearful statement to a friend, she even said, he will be pissed and he will do whatever he feels like doing if I am awarded custody of the kids. That's what she said in another statement. She even said she believed that Bliefnick had serious mental health problems, and he's becoming more vengeful and more predictable. Now, she even expressed fear that he would try to punish me somehow, and worried that seeking an order of protection would both put her in more danger and run the risk of losing the ability to see her 3 sons, Deacon, Grayson, and Arlen. That is what the prosecutors said. And another time, she even told her sister, Sarah Riley, that if something ever happens to me, make sure the number one person of interest is Tim. So she had so much fear about this guy. And so the prosecutors, that's what they were focused on, especially in the closing statements, as the prosecutors reminded the jurors that the evidence showed that Becky said Bliefnick literally cares more about hurting me more than anything else, and that she would never trust him to ever let him in my house if it was just us. That is what she was feeling. And Jones pushed back on the notion that the defendant had a right to be at the residence and therefore couldn't have committed the crime of home invasion. You see, there was a court order that said, "Thou shalt not," and the defendant was told not to be there. That's what Jones said. He did not have a right to be at the house. We know what John Smith did. John Smith, again, the Facebook profile that he allegedly bought this motorcycle from. Now, Becky had previously confided in her sister. Again, right? So that is a tell story. Now, that's why it's hard to really stop and think about, let's think about how much you were not going to get away with this. Now, Bliefnick, again, at the time of the murder, people were seeing, that they highlighted similarities between John Smith's physical appearance, such as long brown hair, matching Bliefnick's at the time of the murder. John Smith also purchased a black mongoose bike found in Bliefnick's garage. Moreover, the prosecutor mentioned that John Smith drove an orange Rust CRV similar to Bliefnick's vehicle and received notification on his phone regarding the sale of the blue bike to a tall, athletically built man. Again, 2009 inductee into the Quincy Football Hall of Fame. The prosecutor posed a rhetorical question stating, "Do we have to look outside to know that it's raining?" implying that the identity of John Smith and his actions were clear. The prosecution emphasized that every time the defendant rode the bike, Bliefnick's cell phone, laptop, and Whoop armband showed no activity during crucial times, including the period of the murder. On February 13th, 10 days before the murder, Becky's new boyfriend, Ted Johnson, visited her home. And so during this time, there was no activity recorded on Bliefnick's computer from 2:02 p.m. until 1:10 a.m. And the defendant made a call at 7:30 p.m. and did not make another until 1:32 a.m. Interestingly, the defendant's Whoop fitness tracking device lost connection around midnight, but mysteriously reconnected around the time when the defendant conducted approximately 200 internet searches over 38 minutes. Again, that's according to the prosecution. Now, one of the alleged searches included, "How do I find the owner of a license plate?" The prosecutor highlighted that at 1:32 a.m., phone call was made to the Missouri Department of Records, presumably to inquire about the owner and VIN number associated with a particular license plate. Now, why do you suppose that he would do that. The prosecution, they suggested that the defendant must have been present outside Becky's home and observed Johnson's car parked there. And Jones, again, the prosecutor, stated that Bliefnick began to exhibit the same behavior that Becky had predicted, saying he started to lose his mind. Prosecution, they say that he waited until the boys were with him on February 22nd, the day before the murder. Instead of picking up his children from school, Bliefnick engaged in an sexual encounter with another woman. Now, after Becky's death, the defendant's behavior became peculiar, as stated by the prosecution. You see, allegedly, on February 23rd, Bliefnick called his son's school at 11:51 a.m. and instructed them not to allow the children to walk home. Now, the school secretary found this request unusual since Bliefnick had never made such a call before. That's according to the prosecutor, Josh Jones. And so the prosecution, they claim that Bliefnick was taking every measure to ensure that the boys did not witness their mother being shot 14 times. They further allege that Bliefnick spent an hour waiting in the school parking lot to pick up his children, while just a day earlier at the same time he was involved in an sexual encounter with someone else. They literally track a lot of this. It's mind-blowing what people think they'll get away with, as Josh Jones asserted. Only after he picks up the boys does he text Becky's dad, expressing concern about Becky's whereabouts. He waited until he had the boys with him before reaching out. When Becky's father returned Bliefnick's call, the defendant did not answer. How worried could he really be? And so prosecutors argued that Bliefnick intentionally avoided the call because he knew he needed someone else to discover Becky's body. That's what the prosecution was saying. Now, when the defendant finally calls that phone back at 4:14 p.m., what does he do? He lies. That's what Jones stated. Allegedly, Bliefnick claimed that the school had contacted him to pick up the boys. Jones refuted this claim, stating, "That's not what happened. We know he called the school," before questioning, why did he lie? What reason does he have to lie about that? Furthermore, Mr. Jones revealed that just 4 days after the murder, investigators discovered the blue bicycle with no reflectors abandoned half a block away from Bliefnick's residence. Can you just wash off gunpowder residue? That's what the prosecution presented evidence indicating that the defendant had an empty gun safe and that there was no laptop activity during the times when the bike rides occurred. And according to Jones, every time the person on the bike was seen, there was no cell phone or computer activity, and the defendant's whoop device conveniently disconnected. He questioned, what more do you need to see to establish a connection? Again, that Timothy Bliefnick is the only person that could possibly be connected to this murder. Mr. Jones proceeded to show jurors various Google searches, such as how to forcefully open a door with a crowbar, the average police response time in Quincy, Illinois, how to check gun registration, weather whoop records, precise usage times, and how to remove gunpowder residue. The prosecution deemed these searches incriminating as they contained specific details about the crime that were not publicly disclosed, such as the use of a crowbar or a silencer. According to the state, all of these searches collectively indicated that the defendant's concern about evading capture by the police. And so Mr. Jones, he emphasized that every piece of evidence and every witness pointed to one person and one person only. He stated, in fact, only the defendant had a motive to kill, to execute Becky. The impending divorce and the defendant's perceived loss and inability to achieve his desired outcome pushed him over the edge, just as Becky had predicted. Jones concluded by asserting that the defendant alone was responsible for Becky's execution. He urged the jurors to find the defendant guilty as justice demanded it. Now, of course, that is the prosecutor's side. Now, his defense, Casey Schnack, she says sympathy is not evidence. Casey Schnack, she addressed the jury and asserted that the state's case relied heavily on sympathy and lacked substantial evidence. Now, Casey Schnack, she emphasized that, there is no way that my client could be involved in this. That's why she's saying that sympathy should not play a role in the jury's deliberation, as their task was not to determine whether the situation was sad or to be swayed by sympathy. She believed that, hey, don't be sad, this is the facts. That's her version. She stressed that sympathy is not evidence and accused the prosecution of attempting to undermine the presumption of innocence enjoyed by all defendants. According to Schnack, the burden of proof rested on the state, and Bliefnick was presumed innocent until the jury was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. She refuted the notion that the attention surrounding the divorce between Becky and Bliefnick was a distraction. She even argued that it only demonstrated the fact that they were getting divorced and should not be used to elicit sympathy. During the trial, Casey had previously informed the jurors that the surveillance video of the bike rider merely showed someone going somewhere without providing any identifying characteristics. She reiterated this point in closing arguments, highlighting the lack of information about the person's gender, age, race, height, weight, clothing, origin, destination, or even whether the same person appeared in all the videos. Now, her argument aimed to challenge the credibility of the evidence that was presented by the prosecution and discourage the jury from being swayed by sympathy or making assumptions based on incomplete information from the videos that they were looking at. And, during her closing arguments, the defense, Casey, she emphasized that there was no DNA evidence linking her client to the crime. She pointed out the absence of fingerprint evidence, hair or fiber evidence, and the lack of any incriminating findings on seized gloves or in the trash. Casey, she also cast doubt on the reliability of ballistics, suggesting that it was subject to human error. She addressed the issue of the Google searches, referring to it as the elephant in the room. She argued that the prosecution failed to provide information about when these searches were conducted and who performed them. She suggested that if these searches were conducted after Becky's death, they could simply be attributed to Tim's curiosity about the investigation, similar to what many other people in town may have done. Now, she accused the prosecution of inviting speculation rather than providing concrete evidence, which is generally what the defense will definitely do their best to do, right? Cast doubt, right? There's no good evidence. In a noticeable shift, Schnack accused the prosecutor Jones of attempting to turn the trial into a game show. She criticized the prosecution's approach and reminded the jury that guessing or speculation is not sufficient to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt. She firmly stated that the only verdict in this case should be not guilty. Her arguments aim to challenge the credibility of the evidence that was presented by the prosecution, and she is saying they're lacking so much concrete proof connecting her client. She emphasized the importance of proof beyond that reasonable doubt and to consider the lack of DNA evidence and the potential innocent explanation for the Google searches. And so now, of course, Mr. Jones he has his own rebuttal, right? Sharing that Bliefnick was responsible for this crime without a doubt. And so he's reiterating the totality of the circumstantial evidence that pointed to one conclusion. Bliefnick is responsible. He emphasized that Bliefnick knew Becky would be home alone, knew how to enter the house through his son's empty bedroom by climbing up the pergola, and highlighted the connection between the videos, move data, cell phone data, computer activity, and the searches that were made by himself. And so, of course, he's going to challenge the defense's dismissal of those Google searches. And so Jones points out that they contain details that were not released to the public. Again, that crowbar and the window and the possibility of a silencer. He questioned how Bliefnick would have known these specific details if he was searching for them after Becky's murder, suggesting that only the killer would have that information. Now, he even emphasized that there was no exculpatory evidence such as a phone call, text, Google search, or whoop data that would absolve Bliefnick. He reiterated on the days when Bliefnick was not seen on the bike, his whoop data was fine, indicating that the gaps in activity correlated with his rides to Becky's house. In a passionate tone, Jones described that Bliefnick was the one responsible, highlighting that Becky herself knew that something like this would happen. With the conclusion of the closing arguments, the judge, Robert K. Adrian, he instructed the jury, and they were sent out of the courtroom to begin deliberations. Timothy Bliefnick, he never would get on trial and speak for himself. And so they reached the verdict in this case against his wife, and they found him guilty. And so I think it's key to know about a lot of this. Like, why would he do this? You see, he was arrested on March 3rd of this year, okay? 2 years after actually almost 3 years or 3 years after appearing on Family Feud. Now, the murder weapon, that was never recovered at all. That handgun was missing from her home. And so we don't really even know where that's at. And her gun was one of several models that could have matched with the casings. That's according to the Illinois State Police Forensics. And during the trial, Paso Bliefnick's sister, again, Paso Bliefnick's, that is the one that had the handgun that was missing from her home. And her gun was one of several models that could have matched the gun with all the casings. And so during the trial, Paso Bliefnick's sister, Sarah Riley, she testified that she received a text message that read, "If something ever happens to me, make sure the number one person of interest is Tim," as I shared with you a couple of times. She wanted to make sure that she puts that in writing because she was very fearful that he will somehow harm her, come after her, or try to do something to her that takes her away from the kids or the kids away from her. So he already lied multiple times, which painted himself as, in a corner, but he was trying to make himself look like he's the victim in this. And so it's like no one was buying that except him. My friends, it's stories like this that they get extremely heartbroken. We never understand why these things happen, and truth is, we're probably never will understand. The bottom line is, be aware, be alert, be careful. be safe. There were red flags. There's been a few domestic violence cases where I've shared, man, the one, the Christy Kuchins, or I can't, Cushions, name is slipping right now, something, but it's in the news where she poisoned her husband, right? And he had all these red flags. He knew, like, man, if something happens to me, she's guilty. Christy Richens, something. Richens, Courtney, it's, I'm sure you probably know. But it's in the news, Corey Richens. See, I knew it was going to come to me. And again, he had his doubts. He stayed there. And now he's not here today because he stayed there. Because he didn't want to be away from his kids. Same thing here. She didn't want to lose her kids. But she wanted to put it out there that if something happens to me, look directly at Tim. My friends, I'm Manny Rodriguez, and this has been another case of deep, true crime. My friends, be careful out there. Be safe. Be aware. Rest in peace, Becky Bliefnick. Taken from this world way too soon. Take care. Be safe. Peace.